The shot was the first thing Jack heard. It cracked through the midday calm of Dust Devil Gulch like a whip, sharp and final. Another followed, then a spray of them, a frantic percussion that sent townsfolk scattering like quail. Horses screamed, tethered to hitching posts, their eyes wild. Women pulled children from the dusty street, and men flattened themselves behind water troughs and overturned wagons. Jack Thorne, standing by the blacksmith's forge with a newly repaired bridle in his hand, felt a familiar coldness seep into his bones, a feeling he hadn't known in 5 years. It was the cold of a life. He had buried a life of drawn guns and spilled blood. He didn't move. He simply watched the chaos unfold. The Dust Devil Gulch Bank, a proud 2-story brick building on the main thoroughfare, was the source of the noise. Its windows were shattered, glittering shards of glass strewn across the boardwalk. 4 men, their faces hidden by grimy bandanas, were backing out onto the street, heavy sacks slung over their shoulders. But they weren't just carrying money. They were dragging smaller, heavier canvas bags, the kind used to haul ore. But Jack knew what was inside. They had emptied the safety deposit boxes. A young deputy, barely old enough to grow a proper mustache, burst from the sheriff's office, revolver drawn. He was brave and foolish. "Hold it right there," he yelled, his voice cracking. The leader of the gang, a tall man in a dark duster, didn't even break his stride. He turned, raised his pistol with casual indifference, and fired. The deputy crumpled to the ground, a crimson stain blossoming on his tan shirt. The men laughed, a harsh grating sound that scraped against the sudden silence. They mounted their horses and galloped out of town, leaving behind a cloud of red dust, a dying lawman, and a violated peace. Jack remained frozen, the leather of the bridle growing slick in his palm. His gaze was fixed on the bank, on the dark, gaping maw of its doorway. He knew what was in that bank. Not gold or coin, nothing the world would miss. But inside safety deposit box number 42 was a small, hinged silver locket. It was tarnished with age, its clasp worn smooth from the touch of his fingers. Inside, behind a tiny pane of glass, was a miniature portrait of Sarah, his wife. Her smile, the light in her eyes, the gentle curve of her cheek, it was all he had left of her. It was his anchor in a world that had tried to drown him in grief. They hadn't just robbed a bank. They had broken into a tomb. They had stolen his last ghost. The coldness in his bones ignited into a slow-burning fire. He dropped the bridle in the dust. The townsfolk were emerging now, a low murmur of horror and fear rising from the crowd. Someone was screaming for the doctor. Someone else was crying over the fallen deputy. But Jack heard none of it. All he heard was the echo of that laughter, the sound of men who could take a memory and treat it like plunder. For the first time in 5 years, the ghost of the man he used to be stirred from its shallow grave, and it was thirsty for justice. Jack's ranch was a testament to a life lived in the shadow of a memory. Tucked away in a high valley miles from the frantic energy of Dust Devil Gulch, it was a place of profound silence, broken only by the sigh of the wind through the sparse junipers. The porch didn't overlook a snowy landscape. It stared out across a vast expanse of red sand and towering rock formations that glowed like embers under the setting sun. The house itself was small, built of sun-bleached timber and river stone he'd hauled himself. It was a fortress of solitude, and every object within its walls was a carefully preserved relic. Sarah's rocking chair still sat by the hearth, a hand-stitched quilt folded neatly over its arm. Her worn copy of Leaves of Grass lay on the nightstand, a pressed wildflower marking a page she would never finish reading. The house wasn't just dusty. It was embalmed. Jack moved through it with a methodical quiet. A man living by a rigid routine designed to keep the crushing weight of his grief at bay. His hands, thick and calloused from years of ranch work and the grip of a ranger's colt, performed their chores with an efficiency that bordered on ritual. He mended fences, drew water, and tended to his small herd of cattle. His face a stoic mask carved from sun-baked leather. He was a recluse, not by statement, but by the deliberate crushing emptiness he had cultivated around himself. This fragile peace was shattered 2 days after the robbery. He was splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe, a familiar meditation, when he heard the rumble of wheels. A lone buckboard was making its way up the winding trail to his ranch, an unusual sight in a place where visitors were as rare as rain in July. A stout man with a drooping white mustache held the reins, and beside him, huddled together under a thin blanket, were 2 small figures. Jack rested his axe and waited, his expression unreadable. The buckboard creaked to a halt, and the driver, a freight man named Henderson from town, tipped his hat. "Jack," he said, his voice gravelly. "Got a bit of a situation here." He gestured to the children. A boy, perhaps 12 years old, sat ramrod straight, his jaw set with a premature seriousness. His eyes, a startlingly clear blue, met Jack's without flinching. Beside him, a little girl of about 8, clutched a threadbare doll, her face pale and smudged with dirt. Her big brown eyes were wide with a fear she was trying desperately to hide. Stagecoach from Willow Creek, overturned down by the Canyon Pass. Henderson explained, his tone grim. "Bad business. Mr. and Mrs. Gable, they didn't make it." He cleared his throat. "These are their children, William and Clara. They ain't got no other kin in this territory. The parson's wife is laid up with fever, and the orphanage in Prescott is full. I figured, well, you're the closest ranch." Jack's silence was a wall. He looked at the children, their faces small and lost against the immense, indifferent landscape. He saw the way the boy William kept his arm protectively around his sister, a silent promise to stand between her and the world. He saw the girl Clara bury her face in her doll's yarn hair, seeking comfort from an inanimate object, because there was nowhere else to find it. Something in their shared desolation resonated with the hollow space in his own chest. "I ain't a family man." Jack said, his voice rusty from disuse. "I know that." Henderson replied, his gaze sympathetic. "But they got nowhere else to go, Jack. Just for a few days till the circuit judge passes through." Jack looked from the freight man's weary face to the children's frightened one. He had built this life to keep the world out, to ensure no one could ever get close enough to hurt him again or for him to hurt them. But here, the world was on his doorstep, small, helpless, and bleeding. He thought of the locket of the life that had been stolen from him. Now here was more life adrift and broken. He let out a long, slow breath, and the air burning in his lungs. He gave a single curt nod. "Leave them." Henderson's shoulders slumped with relief. He helped the children down from the buckboard, placing a small battered trunk at their feet. William stood guard over it, as if it held the last remnants of their former life. Clara refused to let go of her doll. "Thank you, Jack," Henderson said, tipping his hat again before turning the buckboard around. As the wagon rumbled away, leaving a plume of dust in its wake, Jack was left alone on his patch of earth with 2 orphans who looked at him as if he were both their jailer and their only savior. He didn't know it yet, but the silence he had so carefully constructed was about to be broken forever. The sun was a searing orange ball on the horizon when Sheriff Brody's horse crested the ridge. Jack saw him coming from a mile off, a lone rider, moving with the slow, weary gait of a man carrying too heavy a burden. Jack didn't go out to meet him. He stayed on the porch, cleaning his rifle, the metallic clicks of the action sharp in the evening air. William was stacking firewood by the side of the house, his movements precise and focused, while Clara sat on the steps, whispering stories to her doll. Sheriff Brody was an old man, his face a road map of wrinkles, and his shoulders stooped from decades of wearing a tin star. He dismounted with a groan, his eyes falling on the children for a moment before settling on Jack. "Evening, Jack." Brody said, his voice tired. Jack grunted in reply, not looking up from his rifle. I see Henderson found you. Brody observed, nodding toward William and Clara. They needed a place, Jack said flatly. It's temporary. Everything's temporary. The sheriff sighed, leaning against a porch post. He took off his hat and wiped a sleeve across his sweaty brow. I came about the robbery. Jack finally looked up, his eyes cold and hard. Heard about it. Heard you lost a deputy. Benji was a good kid. Green but good. Those men, they shot him down for sport. Brody's gaze was direct. They're professionals, Jack. They knew the patrol schedule, knew the safe combination was kept in the manager's desk. They moved fast and clean. I ain't got the men or the skill to track them in the Badlands. But you do. Jack went back to cleaning his rifle. My tracking days are over, Brody. I'm a rancher now. You were the best damn ranger in Texas. Brody pressed his voice, gaining an edge of frustration. Those skills don't just rust away. Jack, this town needs the man. You are not the ghost you've become. The words hit their mark. Jack's hands stilled. He set the rifle down with a deliberate, quiet click. He stood up, turning to face the old sheriff, his shadow stretching long in the dying light. The man I was is buried with my wife. He said, his voice low and dangerous. You want a hero? Go find one. I'm done. Brody held his ground, his weary eyes filled with a stubborn resolve. This ain't about being a hero. It's about justice. They didn't just take the bank's money, Jack. They cleared out the safety deposit boxes, took everything. Family heirlooms, wedding rings, land deeds. He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle in the air. They took personal items, Jack. I was helping the clerk make a list for the insurance man. He mentioned a woman's effects, a silver locket. Jack's carefully constructed composure shattered. The world seemed to narrow to a single point, the image of that locket in the hands of a laughing, murderous thief. His breath hitched a raw, ragged sound. The fire he'd been nursing since the day of the robbery erupted into a blaze. This was no longer about justice for a town he didn't care for. It was about reclaiming the last piece of his soul. William and Clara had stopped what they were doing, watching the two men with wide, frightened eyes. They saw the shift in Jack, the way his grief transformed into something harder, sharper. I'll help. Jack said, the words torn from his throat. But I'm not doing it for the town, Brody. And I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for me. I want that locket back. That's all. Sheriff Brody nodded slowly, a flicker of sad understanding in his eyes. Whatever the reason, he said, putting his hat back on, I'll take it. He turned to leave, then stopped. The trail's 2 days old, Jack. They'll be deep in the Badlands by now. They left something behind. Jack said, his voice a low growl. They always do. As Brody rode away, Jack stood on the porch, a silhouette against the blood-red sunset. He was no longer a ghost haunting his own life. He was a hunter, and the rage that fueled him was as vast and unforgiving as the desert itself. Dust Devil Gulch was a town holding its breath. The raw energy of the robbery had subsided into a thick, simmering stew of fear and suspicion. When Jack Thorne rode in the next morning, mounted on a lean, wiry buckskin that had seen more hard miles than most men, the townsfolk parted for him like he was a storm cloud on the horizon. Mothers pulled their children closer, and men in the saloon fell silent, watching his reflection in the bar mirror. He was a familiar stranger, a man who had lived on the edge of their community for years, but had never been a part of it. Now he was their reluctant champion, and they didn't know whether to be grateful or afraid. He ignored the stairs dismounting in front of the bank. The broken windows were boarded up, but the scars of the violence remained. Sheriff Brody and a new deputy, a young man with an arrogant posture and a chip on his shoulder, met him outside. His name's Miller. Brody said by way of introduction. He thinks he can handle this himself. Deputy Miller sneered. We don't need some washed-up ranger playing hero sheriff. It's a simple tracking job. Then you should have no trouble finding the unique custom-made silver spur one of them left behind. Jack said, his voice flat. Miller's face went blank. You did check the scene properly, didn't you, Deputy? Jack pushed past him and entered the bank. The air inside was stale with the smell of gunpowder and fear. He moved with a quiet intensity, his eyes missing nothing. The floor was scuffed with boot prints, but they were a chaotic mess contaminated by the dozens of people who had rushed in after the fact. Brody and his men had done their best, but they were lawmen, not trackers. Jack knelt, his fingers brushing lightly over the floorboards near the teller's cage, where the shootout had been fiercest. His gaze swept the room, not looking for the obvious, but for the out-of-place. He saw it then glinting from beneath the splintered leg of an overturned writing desk. It was a spur just as he'd predicted. But this was no ordinary piece of hardware. It was crafted from heavy silver, intricately engraved with the image of a coiled rattlesnake, its fangs bared. The rowel was shaped like a star, but one of the points was deliberately broken off. It was a signature piece, something a man would have made to order. He picked it up, wrapping it in a piece of cloth from his pocket. Find the blacksmith who made this, Jack said, turning to Brody, and you'll find our man's name. Miller scoffed. Could have been made anywhere. Texas, Arizona, could be 10 years old. The leather strap is new. Jack countered without looking at him. And the wear on the rowel is fresh. It was made recently. Start with the local smiths, then check the records for every smith within 100 miles. Leaving the bank, Jack made his way to the saloon. The room went quiet as he stepped through the batwing doors. He walked to the bar, the silver spur heavy in his pocket. The bartender, a burly man named Gus, polished a glass, refusing to meet his eye. I need information. Jack said, his voice low enough that only Gus could hear. Ain't got none, Gus mumbled. Saw what you saw. 4 men rode off west. One of them was wearing a spur, Jack said, placing the object on the bar. The engraved snake seemed to writhe in the dim light. Ever seen one like it? Gus's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before he regained his composure. Nope, can't say I have. But it was too late. Jack had seen the flicker of recognition. 4 men rode in a few days before the robbery. Jack pressed. Strangers. They would have needed supplies, a place to drink. Someone must have seen something. From a dark corner, Deputy Miller spoke up, his voice dripping with condescension. You're wasting your time, Thorne. These are ghosts. They're long gone. Jack ignored him, his gaze locked on Gus. The man who wore this spur, he said, his voice like stones grinding together. He's arrogant. He'd want to show this off. He would have talked. A grizzled old prospector at the end of the bar, emboldened by whiskey, piped up. Did see a fellow with fancy spurs, few nights back, bragging about a big score coming his way. Said his boss Elias was a man who paid his debts. The name hung in the air. Elias. It was a start. Thank you, Jack said to the old man, pocketing the spur. As he turned to leave, he stopped in front of Miller. A simple tracking job, you said. The first step in tracking a man, Deputy, is learning to listen. You should try it sometime. He walked out into the harsh sunlight, the hostility of the town at his back. He had a clue and a name. It was more than enough. The trail was waiting. The Badlands were a brutal, beautiful furnace. Jagged rock spires clawed at a bleached white sky, and the wind whispered through canyons carved by millennia of water and time. It was a land that tolerated no mistakes. For Jack, it was like coming home. The skills he had tried to bury came back to him as naturally as breathing. He read the story of the gang's passage in the displaced stones, the crushed sagebrush, the depth and spacing of the hoof prints in the hard-packed earth. They were riding hard but not panicked. They were confident. He tracked them for 2 days, the sun beating down on his back, the silence of the desert his only companion. He made camp at night, his fire small and smokeless, his senses on high alert. He was a predator on the hunt, every nerve ending alive with purpose. On the 3rd day, he found the first sign that this was more than a simple robbery. The trail led him past the ruins of a burned-out way station. It had been a vital stop for the stagecoach line, providing fresh horses and water. Now it was a blackened scar on the landscape. As he circled the perimeter, Jack noticed something odd. The station's main investor, the man who owned the land and the building, was Silas Blackwood. He pressed on his instincts, humming with a new unease. The next day he found a dead man. It was one of the gang, judging by the clothes, and the horse tethered nearby its saddlebags, empty. The man hadn't been shot in a gunfight. He'd been executed a single bullet hole in the back of his head. A message. No loose ends. The trail shifted, leading him north toward a series of remote mining claims. One by one he found them raided, their equipment smashed, their water supplies poisoned. He checked the claim markers at each site. All of them were registered to one man, Silas Blackwood. A pattern was emerging cold and clear. These weren't random acts of banditry. This was a calculated, systematic attack aimed at one person. The bank robbery, the murder of the deputy, the destruction of the way station, the raids on the mines, they were all designed to financially cripple the wealthiest man in Dust Devil Gulch. By destabilizing Blackwood, the gang was destabilizing the entire region, driving down land values and sowing chaos. But why? Late that afternoon, Jack was scouting a high ridge when he spotted a rider below a lone figure moving away from the main group. A scout, or perhaps a deserter. Jack urged his horse down a steep, rocky decline, cutting the man off in a narrow canyon. The rider, a young man with fear in his eyes, went for his gun, but Jack was faster. His Colt was drawn and aimed before the man's hand had even cleared leather. "Don't," Jack said, his voice calm and deadly. The man froze. "I ain't done nothing." "You ride with the gang that hit Dust Devil Gulch," Jack stated. "I've been following your trail for days." "We was just taking what was owed," the man stammered. "Owed for what?" Jack asked, nudging his horse closer. "This isn't about gold. You're trying to ruin Silas Blackwood. Why?" The man's fear was warring with a misplaced loyalty. He shook his head. "I ain't saying nothing." Jack dismounted, walking slowly toward him. "Your friends left one of your own with a bullet in his head, back at the dry gulch. You think they won't do the same to you?" The man paled. That was different. He talked too much. "So talk to me," Jack pressed. "What is this really about?" The young bandit finally broke. He looked around wildly, as if expecting to see ghosts in the rocks. "Look, mister, you don't understand. This ain't about gold. It's about a debt owed to Elias." There it was again. The name. "What debt?" Jack demanded. "The kind that gets paid in blood." The man whispered, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond his immediate situation. "It's about what happened at Crimson Creek. It's always been about Crimson Creek." Before Jack could ask another question, the man spurred his horse, bolting past him and deeper into the canyon. Jack let him go. He had what he needed. Crimson Creek. The name hit Jack like a physical blow. It was the name of his last mission as a Texas Ranger. A bloody, chaotic firefight 5 years ago. A shootout that had ended his career, shattered his life, and cost him everything he had ever loved. He had tried to bury that day, to erase it from his memory. But the desert never forgot, and a debt owed to Elias was about to come due. The gang's hideout was a ghost town, a collection of collapsed adobe huts nestled in the shadow of a monolithic red mesa. It was a place the law had forgotten, a perfect refuge for men who lived outside of it. Jack approached on foot, leaving his horse tied in a ravine a mile back. He moved like a phantom through the rocks, his senses sharp, the setting sun casting his long shadow ahead of him. He saw them before they saw him, a half-dozen men gathered around a fire, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. And in the center, standing apart, was their leader. Jack recognized him instantly, not by his face, but by his posture, that same arrogant confidence he'd seen in 100 dangerous men. He was tall and lean, dressed in a black duster, his features sharp and intelligent. This had to be Elias Vance. Jack stepped out from behind a rock outcropping, his Colt held loosely at his side. "Elias," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. The men around the fire scrambled for their guns, but their leader raised a hand, stopping them. He turned slowly, and a chilling smile spread across his face. It was a smile of recognition, of triumph. Jack Thorne. "Elias," said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "I was wondering when you'd arrive. I must say you're more persistent than I remembered." "I want my locket," Jack said, his voice a low growl. Elias chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Always so direct. You haven't changed at all." He took a step forward into the full light of the fire. "Do you know who I am, Jack? I mean, do you really know?" Jack's eyes narrowed. "I know you're the man who's going to give me back what's mine. What's yours?" Elias's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. "You speak of what is yours. Let me tell you about what was mine. I had a brother. His name was Daniel. A good man, but reckless. He fell in with the wrong crowd." Jack's blood ran cold. He remembered Daniel Vance, a young outlaw caught in the crossfire at Crimson Creek. "You remember him, don't you?" Elias spat, his voice trembling with a rage that had festered for 5 long years. "You remember Crimson Creek? The day you and your rangers rode in, guns blazing. You shot my brother down in the dust. He was surrendering, Jack. His hands were in the air, and you put a bullet in his heart. He was armed." Jack said, the memory flooding back sharp and painful. It was chaos. Men were dying on both sides. Now, was it chaos when the bullet that killed your wife was fired? The word struck Jack with the force of a physical blow. He staggered back, his mind reeling. "What are you talking about?" Elias's face was a twisted mask of grief and hatred. "Oh, you didn't know the official report was so tidy. Mrs. Thorne tragically caught in the crossfire, killed by an outlaw's stray bullet. A convenient lie to protect the reputation of a heroic Texas Ranger. But I was there, Jack. I was hiding in the rocks watching. I saw it all." He pointed a trembling finger at Jack. "The bullet that killed Sarah wasn't from one of my brother's men. It came from the ridge behind you. It came from a ranger's rifle. A ricochet, maybe, or a panicked shot. It doesn't matter. Your men killed her. You killed her. You brought the violence to her doorstep, and she paid the price for your precious duty." The world tilted on its axis. Every memory Jack had of that day was a lie, a carefully constructed fiction to shield him from an unbearable truth. Sarah, killed by his own side. The guilt he had carried for 5 years was nothing compared to the crushing weight of this revelation. "My brother is dead because of you." Elias continued, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Your wife is dead because of you. So I made a promise to myself that day. I would take everything from you, just as you took everything from me. I spent years planning it. Ruining Silas Blackwood was the first step, that he was the one who funded your ranger company after all. A little poetic justice. But the true prize was always the locket." He reached into his duster and pulled out the small silver object. It glinted in the firelight. "I wanted this," Elias hissed. "I wanted to steal the last physical memory of the woman you failed to protect. I wanted you to feel the same empty, helpless rage that I have felt every single day for 5 years. This was never about gold, Jack. It was always about this. It was always about you." Jack stared at the locket, at the man holding it, and the entire narrative of his life fell apart. He wasn't a grieving widower seeking justice. He was a guilty man, haunted by a sin he hadn't even known he'd committed, and his quest for redemption was nothing more than the final act in a tragedy orchestrated by the brother of a man he had killed. The journey back to his ranch was a blur of dust and despair. Elias's words echoed in Jack's mind, a relentless chorus of accusation and truth. "You killed her." He rode through the night, not out of haste, but because he couldn't bear to stop, couldn't bear to be alone with the magnitude of his failure. The locket, once a symbol of love and loss, was now a totem of his guilt. He arrived at dawn, the first rays of sun painting the sky in shades of pink and gray colors that seemed to mock the darkness in his soul. But the familiar sight of his home brought no comfort. The front door was splintered, hanging crookedly on one hinge. The windows were smashed. The profound silence he had once cherished was now sinister, a void where life should have been. He dismounted, his heart pounding in his chest, and drew his Colt. He moved through the ransacked house with a dreadful certainty growing in his gut. Furniture was overturned, drawers were emptied, and the few simple possessions he owned were scattered across the floor. In the center of the room, lying in a heap of broken pottery, was Clara's doll, its yarn hair torn, one of its button eyes missing. He raced through the small house, his calls echoing in the emptiness. "William, Clara." There was no answer. They were gone. On the kitchen table, pinned beneath a hunting knife, driven deep into the wood, was a folded piece of paper. His hands trembled as he pulled it free. The message was short, written in a stark, angular script. "Thorn. The past has a way of catching up. If you want to see the children again, you know what you have to do. Come to the old Serpent's Tooth silver mine. Come alone. You can fight for the memory in the locket, or you can fight for the future you've stumbled into. The choice is yours." Elias. A wave of icy fury washed over Jack, momentarily eclipsing his grief. Elias hadn't just exposed his past. He had stolen his future. William and Clara. In the short time they had been with him, they had begun to chisel away at the walls he had built around his heart. Their presence had filled the silent corners of his house with whispers of what could be, of a life beyond sorrow. He had taken them in out of a reluctant sense of duty, but somewhere along the way, that duty had become something more. It had become a protective instinct, a flicker of hope in the long darkness. Elias had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought Jack's world revolved around a silver locket, a relic of a dead past. He didn't understand that the kidnapping of the children had fundamentally changed the stakes. The locket was a memory he wanted to reclaim. The children were a future he now realized he would die to protect. Jack walked back outside, the morning sun glinting off the barrel of his gun. He looked toward the jagged peaks in the distance, where the Serpent's Tooth mine lay dormant and decaying. The choice wasn't a choice at all. His past had been a prison of guilt and sorrow. His future, however brief and uncertain, was with 2 orphans who had nowhere else to go. He would get them back, and he would send Elias Vance to the hell he so richly deserved. The Serpent's Tooth mine was a gaping wound in the side of the mountain, its entrance choked with debris and skeletal timbers. A sandstorm was brewing on the horizon, the sky turning a bruised shade of yellow as the wind began to howl, kicking up curtains of sand that stung the skin and obscured the landscape. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a savage energy that mirrored the storm in Jack's own soul. He approached the mine cautiously, using the howling wind and swirling dust as cover. Elias would be expecting him at the main entrance, but Jack had no intention of walking into a trap. He circled around the base of the mountain, his knowledge of this harsh land serving him well. He knew of a secondary ventilation shaft, a narrow, treacherous opening halfway up a rock face, long forgotten by anyone who hadn't spent years exploring these hills. He climbed the wind threatening to tear him from his handholds and slipped into the darkness of the mine. The air inside was cold and stagnant, smelling of damp earth and decay. He lit a small lantern, its dim glow pushing back the oppressive blackness, revealing a labyrinth of collapsing tunnels and rotting support beams. The wind moaned through the shafts, making the old timbers creak and groan like dying giants. It was a perfect tomb. He moved deeper into the mine, his boots silent on the dusty floor. He could hear voices echoing from a larger chamber ahead. He crept forward, using the shadows as his shield until he could see them. Elias stood in the center of a cavernous space, a single lantern casting his long, distorted shadow against the rock wall. William and Clara were tied to a thick support pillar, their faces pale with fear. Two of Elias's men stood guard. "He'll be here soon," Elias was saying, his voice confident. "And then this will all be over." As he spoke, he gestured to a small wooden crate at his feet. It was filled with ledgers and stacks of letters. Jack's eyes narrowed. He recognized the elegant letterhead on one of the documents, Blackwood Enterprises. "Once Thorn is dealt with." Elias continued, addressing one of his men. "Take this crate directly to Blackwood. He'll have our payment, and the deed to this town will officially be his." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Silas Blackwood, the town's benevolent benefactor, had hired Elias to drive Dust Devil Gulch into bankruptcy so he could buy up the land and its resources for a pittance. The bank robbery, the ruined claims, it was all part of the plan. Elias, in turn, had used Blackwood's money and resources to fund his elaborate, deeply personal quest for revenge. It was a conspiracy woven from greed and hatred, with the entire town caught in the middle. Jack knew he couldn't just fight his way out. He had to save the children, defeat Elias, and secure the evidence to expose Blackwood. He saw his chance. A pile of loose shale and rock lay near the ceiling above one of the guards. Taking careful aim, he fired his Colt. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space, and the bullet struck the rock, sending a cascade of debris down onto the unsuspecting guard, knocking him unconscious. Chaos erupted. The second guard opened fire wildly into the shadows. Elias shoved the children behind him, drawing his own weapon. "Thorn, show yourself, you coward." Jack used the confusion to move a ghost in the darkness. He took out the second guard with a shot to the shoulder, then melted back into the tunnels. The psychological battle began. "You brought them here to die, Elias." Jack's voice echoed through the mine. "Just like you left your brother to die at Crimson Creek." "Liar." Elias screamed, firing blindly into the darkness. "I tried to save him." Jack navigated the treacherous tunnels, circling around, to come up behind the main chamber. He could see Elias growing more frantic, his taunts becoming more desperate. The mine groaned around them, the support beams creaking under the strain of the raging sandstorm outside. Dust and pebbles rained down from the ceiling. "You blame me for Sarah's death." Jack called out, his voice filled with a cold, hard certainty. "But you're the one who led a war to her home. You and Blackwood, you're two sides of the same rotten coin." He burst from a side tunnel, catching Elias by surprise. He kicked the lantern over, plunging the cavern into near total darkness, illuminated only by the frantic muzzle flashes of their guns. Jack dove for the wooden crate, sliding it away from the fight and into the safety of a side passage. He had the evidence. And now for the children. He lunged through the darkness, tackling Elias. They crashed to the floor, a desperate, brutal struggle of fists and fury. Elias was younger, faster, but Jack was fueled by a righteous rage. He slammed Elias's head against the rocky ground, stunning him. He scrambled to the pillar and began cutting through the children's ropes with his knife. "It's all right," he whispered, his voice steady. I've got you. A low rumble started deep within the mountain. The main support beam, damaged by stray bullets, began to splinter. The entire mine was coming down. "We have to go," Jack yelled, grabbing William and Clara. Elias staggered to his feet, blood streaming from his head, his eyes wild with madness. "You're not leaving," he shrieked, raising his pistol. At that moment, the main beam shattered. The ceiling gave way, and tons of rock and earth began to fall. Jack shoved the children ahead of him, shielding them with his body as they scrambled for the ventilation shaft. He looked back once to see Elias Vance, the man consumed by the past, being swallowed by the earth, his final curse lost in the deafening roar of the collapsing mine. Jack pushed the children through the narrow opening and out into the screaming wind of the sandstorm and the evidence crate clutched under his arm. They were alive. They were free. And the truth was finally coming to light. They emerged from the dying storm like survivors from a buried world. The journey back to Dust Devil Gulch was slow, a somber procession through a landscape scoured clean by the wind. Jack rode with Clara in front of him, her small body curled against his chest, while William rode close beside them, his face set with a grim maturity that no boy his age should possess. No one spoke. The roar of the collapsing mine and the ghosts of the past filled the silence between them. Jack had recovered the locket from Elias's coat before they fled the mine. It felt different in his hand, now heavier. It was no longer just a symbol of his grief for Sarah, a private shrine to what he had lost. It was a testament to what he had fought to protect, a link between a past he could not change and a future he had almost let slip away. Its meaning had been forged anew in darkness and violence, and it now represented not just loss, but survival. They rode into town as dusk was settling, the air still hazy with dust. The townsfolk who saw them stared in stunned silence. The sight of the grizzled recluse Jack Thorne returning from the Badlands with the 2 missing orphans was a scene none of them had expected to witness. Jack didn't stop until he reached the sheriff's office. He dismounted, helped the children down, and walked inside the wooden crate under his arm. Sheriff Brody looked up from his desk, his face a mixture of shock and profound relief. "Jack," he breathed. "The children, they're safe." Jack said, his voice raw. He placed the crate on the Brody's desk. "Elias Vance is dead. The Serpent's Tooth mine collapsed on him and his men." He opened the crate, revealing the ledgers and letters within. "This is why. Silas Blackwood hired Vance to terrorize this region, to bankrupt the town so he could buy it for nothing. Vance used his money to settle an old score with me." Brody stared at the evidence, his weary eyes widening as he absorbed the depth of the betrayal. He picked up a letter signed with Blackwood's flamboyant signature, his jaw tightening. "That son of a..." At that moment, Deputy Miller entered the office, his usual swagger gone, replaced by a look of confusion. "Sheriff, Mr. Blackwood is here. He's demanding to know what's being done about the Vance gang." Brody stood up, a new fire in his eyes. He strapped on his gun belt. "Perfect timing," he said, his voice like iron. "Deputy, you're about to witness some real justice." He looked at Jack. "I can't thank you enough." "Don't thank me," Jack said, turning to William and Clara. "Just make sure he pays for what he's done." He led the children out of the office, just as Silas Blackwood, resplendent in a fine suit and a look of feigned concern, was striding up the steps. The man's face paled when he saw Jack, then turned to pure terror when he saw Sheriff Brody emerge behind him, a warrant and a revolver in his hand. Jack didn't stay to watch. He lifted the children onto his horse and began the slow ride back to the ranch. As they left the lights of Dust Devil Gulch behind, a quiet settled over them different from the one that had preceded their journey. This was a quiet of exhaustion, of safety, of a shared ordeal survived. He had faced the ghosts of his past, and in saving the lives of 2 children, he had inadvertently begun to save himself. In the weeks that followed, a fragile sense of normalcy returned to the ranch. The shattered door was replaced, the broken windows mended. The work was hard, but it was a healing kind of work. Under the vast, clear desert sky, Jack, William, and Clara began the quiet, unceremonious process of becoming a family. Jack formally filed adoption papers with the circuit judge, a simple act of paperwork that felt more significant than any gunfight he had ever won. The silence of the house was gone, replaced by the sounds of life. Clara's soft humming as she helped in the kitchen, William's thoughtful questions as Jack taught him how to track and mend fences, the shared laughter over a warm meal at the end of a long day. These sounds filled the spaces that grief had long kept empty. Jack found himself sleeping through the night for the first time in years, the nightmares of Crimson Creek slowly receding, replaced by the simple grounding reality of his new responsibilities. One evening, as a cool breeze drifted down from the high peaks, Jack stood before the stone fireplace. The fire crackled warmly, casting a golden glow across the room. He took the silver locket from his pocket. He opened it, looking at the tiny, smiling portrait of Sarah one last time. For years, this image had been a source of private, agonizing pain. He had kept it locked away in a dark bank vault, a secret sorrow he could visit but never share. Now he saw not just the woman he had lost, but the love that had once made him whole. A love that had taught him how to care for others, a lesson he was only now relearning. With a steady hand, he did something he never thought he would do. Instead of locking the locket away in a drawer, he hung it from a small iron hook on the mantelpiece right beside the hearth. There, in the warm light of the home, it was no longer a hidden wound, but a gentle memory, a part of the story of the man he was and the family he now had. A few days later, a rider from the nearest telegraph station brought an unexpected delivery. It was an official-looking envelope bearing the seal of the Texas Rangers. Jack opened it with a sense of apprehension, half expecting a summons or a reprimand. Instead, it was a letter. It spoke of the events in Dust Devil Gulch, of the exposure of Silas Blackwood's conspiracy, and the end of Elias Vance's reign of terror. It was a formal pardon for any transgressions during his final chaotic mission at Crimson Creek, acknowledging the difficult circumstances and commending his recent heroism. The letter, officially and finally, closed the door on his old life. He was no longer Jack Thorne, the disgraced ranger. He was just Jack Thorne, a rancher, a father. That evening, he sat on the porch with William and Clara. The sun was setting, painting the sky with brilliant strokes of orange, purple, and gold. Clara was leaning against his side, half asleep, while William sat on the steps, whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. A comfortable silence enveloped them, a silence born not of emptiness, but of contentment. Jack put his arm around Clara, drawing her closer, his gaze fixed on the endless horizon. The man who never held a child now held a family. The rest of his life had just begun.